Welcome. This is the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. And a revenue culture is achieved when you maximize your profit because you optimize your people in a low friction context. And we bring you interesting people who are doing cool stuff, and we bring you interesting ideas, and it's your chance to just learn and reflect and contribute by sending us emails or giving us feedback. Today, I've got Michael Mueller with me, and I've had the opportunity to work with Michael now, I guess it's about 3 years. And Michael's one of the founders of Two Story. And Two Story is, you're going to hear, is a very cool company that combines behavioral assessments with AI, with operational outcomes, and they've worked with small companies, government, major universities, all kinds of cool places. And we're going to get him to share some of that with us. And one thing you're going to hear about today is he actually has been on the faculty of the School of Journalism. And when you learn about his technical background and some of the cool things he's done, I've got to hear that full story, and I think it will be interesting. And his use of language has always impressed me. And one of the terms he turned me on to, which we're going to use as today's theme, is root cause. And I know we've all heard that before, but he's going to bring it to us in some new ways. Root cause is going to combine all kinds of different data that help us really see things we haven't seen before. So, Michael, welcome. I'm thrilled to have you here.
Delighted to be here today, Rick. Thank you for hosting.
Well, so I've got to start with, give us your background. And as part of that, of course, I want to hear about how you got to Two Story and the work you're doing. But I do want to hear about the School of Journalism as part of that.
That's a story that hasn't come up yet over the last few years. Happy to go there. Early in my education and training, I was trained as a biochemist and learned to appreciate the value of complex systems, and later went on to participate and complete an MBA. And although that term MBA can mean so many different things at different universities, my particular time in business school was characterized with a really particular theme. I have a record, Rick, that I'm quite proud of. This was my favorite part of the MBA program, and it's a record that will not be broken at my alma mater. I had, during my graduate studies, a record for the most credit hours dedicated towards independent studies of any student they'd ever had. And independent studies in our context was a collaboration between students and often a team of professors where the student led the creation of a course and then partnered with faculty to borrow their expertise. And this set the stage for, frankly, an opportunity for me to explore a ton of different curiosities. And it became a lot of the seeds that later formed Two Story. These graduate studies were opportunities to learn about, like we did a study on entrepreneurship, and we looked at the characteristics that defined successful entrepreneurs. And this took on a life of its own. It led to collaboration with early stage investors, angels, VCs, accelerators. Later, we presented the results at the Angel Capital Association event at their annual summit for the year. We partnered with behavioral scientists and looked at the differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and how it informs rewards and recognition systems in the workplace. And one of my favorite stories, this becomes the beginning of the work with the School of Journalism, but we spent a semester looking at the neuroscience of story structure, and in particular how it influences data storytelling and how it influences leadership communication. This course that was developed in partnership with the Novak Leadership Institute, a group under the School of Journalism, is now embedded into their core curriculum. And so I later found out during my last semester there that I had taken twice as many credit hours for these independent studies than anybody else had ever attempted. And so they didn't, as a program, they didn't know that they needed to have a maximum, like a ceiling on the number of credit hours you could have. And so I was grandfathered in, but they have since put a limit. And so I think it's 12 or so. But it was by far my favorite part of the MBA program, and such a rich place to collaborate with brilliant faculty that were gracious and really willing to share their time and expertise. And so a lot of these interests and these different subject matters became the foundation for a career in consulting. So for now, about a decade, I've spent my time in consulting, and it's been such a privilege. I've worked with and had the honor of working with just some amazing organizations. You hit on a few of the industry segments. We're relatively industry agnostic, but have worked with just some of the most incredible organizations like NASDAQ and Los Alamos and a variety of university systems ranging from University of California and University of Central Florida, state governments like the state of Missouri and Michigan and others. All of these projects had an emphasis or a focus on trying to solve some complex problem, some strategic macro problem like how do I transform academic scientists into entrepreneurial leaders? Or why are my people leaving and what can I do about it? And so when you talk about root cause analysis, we frankly have to take that approach when solving these macro problems. There's too many contributing factors to these really, really strategic macro problems. And so we've developed some tools and technology to be able to identify the root cause so that we can make an impact in something that matters.
Wow. And like I say, we've known each other 3 or more years, and I've always marveled at how you pull various things together and you see not just the tactical work we're doing, but you see the broad strokes to it, both short-term and long-term. And when I hear your academic story now, I'm starting to see where all that came from.
It's borderline distractible. The different subject matters, I just so appreciate them. I get asked all the time, like, why did you study biochemistry, and do you use even 1% of what you spent time on? And the answer is like overwhelmingly yes. The rigor of thinking about systems, like the human body is like one of the most complex systems ever created. And to be able to train and learn from people that had a pretty non-obvious and yet rigorous way of understanding systems and thinking about how changes in one part might impact the other. I mean, thank you for your affirmation. I so appreciate that, because I think it's important that we try to appreciate some of the ripple effects of big systems. In general, like nothing lives in a vacuum. So I think appreciating the environmental impact, the environmental constraints that impact an individual. I mean, I think about it in every single consulting project, right? We're asked oftentimes by a client to help them solve a particular symptom, and that they would call it their problem, but it's often a symptom. And what we have really built the muscle to learn how to do is to dig in a little bit and to help them identify what is the true contributing factors, the series of contributing factors. And I have to give credit where credit's due. One of my business partners at Two Story, Carrie Goyette, she was trained as a forensic interviewer and a clinical therapist. And so as much as I bring some of the systemic theory, she has her own set of experiences and skills to decipher and to separate signal from noise. And so we love what we do. I mean, I think there's so much value, and there's such a sense of meaning and purpose to move the needle in something really meaningful. And rather than get 50% better at something that doesn't matter, we're really trying to tackle problems that matter. Questions like, why do people leave, and what can I do about it? It's quite meaningful.
Well, I warned you we might not follow our agenda for today at all, and you already have my brain off track. Because one of the things is I'm listening to the work you do and familiar with some of it. A lot of the people that you work with would be masters at living in a silo. They're engineers or scientists or programmers or psychologists, and they speak programming or they speak engineering and they think engineering or finance, whatever it is they do. And communicating across those silos to unify and align is a marvelous skill. And as I'm listening to you, I'm starting to hear you speak multiple languages when you can speak chemistry and you can speak human psychology and you can speak AI. Talk to me a little bit about the how do you help your clients see what you see and
Of
not
course.
see it as a threat?
Yeah.
Too often they individually as an individual we kind of go, oh man, that's scary, I don't already speak that language, or I don't understand that. Is that part of your work?
Yeah, it's certainly a part of our work. I think during the early phases of the project, even as we introduce the project to new stakeholders within the client, as we go through some of the prep conversations and bring those leaders from across the different functional groups together, there's a need to find common ground. And I'll use this analogy of altitude for a moment. If we imagine that all of the functional groups live at 10,000 feet or below, legitimately, there are sometimes very little pieces of common ground between their different functional groups. And so what we're often encouraging them to do is to come up in altitude, to find business outcomes that we all care about, and then identify how our functional groups have a responsibility and an opportunity to contribute to this higher altitude business outcome. And so if I could share a quick story, I think this will illustrate this pretty well. I've mentioned already some of our work with higher ed, and I remember quite well about 4 years ago when we were beginning some of our early work with the University of California system. I spent a lot of time with the graduate dean at the University of California, Irvine, and she had a background, a PhD in computer sciences, so she really understood the technology, which helped. But as we were exploring different use cases, different opportunities, different places to apply the technology, we were searching for problems or opportunities that had a really significant value to the whole system, to all the stakeholders. And so ultimately, to make a long story short, we landed on student retention and persistence as a problem that every functional group cared about. And to illustrate this, I'll just share a little bit of information. Like for the university, for the institution, there is a significant financial investment in graduate students. For graduate programs, there's an enormous incentive for them to retain their students, to maintain the flow of resources to their program, to maintain the rankings associated with their program. To the lead researchers and the PIs, the faculty, who depend on graduate students to contribute to the research, to put in the work, to be a labor force even, to do the work. They require retention. And for the students, there's a host of things that they have on the line. For them to not graduate, to not complete their program, they have a sunk financial cost. They have delayed professional experience that may set them back from their preferred timeline. And so you can imagine when I meet these different stakeholders and they all have their own pet project, their own vested interest in a particular outcome, it is hard to find common ground and bring people together. But what we discovered was that something like retention for the students was common ground that everybody could get behind and participate for. And so a lot of my process and of our work early on and even meeting a prospective client is identifying what would be the outcome that changes everything for your functional group and for more importantly, your organization as a whole. And the solution is not always like readily apparent, but we spend an enormous amount of time defining the problem and identifying a problem that's worth solving for all the stakeholders, because I think it pays dividends throughout the whole project. We have all those functional groups I mentioned have people volunteering their discretionary time to help, to participate, to be a part of the solution because they care about the problem. There's less of an infighting amongst functional groups and more of an alignment because we collectively understand the problem and we care about the problem.
Wow. That is so powerful and cool. One of my favorite books, who actually one of the people you and I work with at the Brooks Group, was responsible for two wonderful books around revenue. One is Challenger Sales and one is Challenger Customer. And in the Challenger Customer book, they talk about the exact scenario you just described. that typically in any kind of complex deal today, there's 7 to 10 different people who are instrumental, critical, necessary to actually move the needle forward.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can get a contract and do no work and create no outcome. That's not what we're talking about. If you want to really have an impact, which I think you used that word 3 times already, you need to have all those silos volunteering their time, being interested. And it's the books are spectacular, but one of the things it said to me, and as I'm listening to you, I'm hearing it, is the traditional role where people think of sales as pitching or coming in and talking people into things becomes facilitation. And it becomes facilitation for the benefit of all the people in the room.
Yeah.
And it, you know, in my work, we teach this kind of the Simon Sinek way, that it always starts with why, which is you're talking about going up from 10,000 feet to 40. You're getting them up to that. Why are we doing this? Why are we here? What is it that we're all committed to as a group? And then start to come down to, well, how are we, if this is our why, how do we do this? And then we eventually get to what are the details. And the concept of facilitation across those silos is a skill set that not many people are teaching or even talking about. So I love your approach to this, because I think that, and this won't surprise you, but there's a huge amount of science that says that's the way you're going to move new ideas forward and create change. Because if you don't facilitate or take them up to that 50,000 where they can look down, the only common word between 7 to 10 different people in different groups is price. Otherwise, they don't understand any other concept the same. And so until you take them up and give them that conceptual, why do we care? They don't have anything in common. And so I thank you for that story, because it's a different, it's the same story I see all the time, but with different words and different experiences that help validate some of the things that we think we've seen.
Yeah, and maybe just one thing to add. I love this quote, and I bring it up in almost every client engagement, but the idea is that every behavior makes sense in its context. So if when you talk about these different silos and the infighting that may occur, I try to adopt a posture of like intense curiosity and openness. That if somebody is pushing the brakes on something, there's a reason why. And so while I shared earlier kind of the ideal scenario, and it works from time to time, there are often instances where somebody has real scar tissue because they've been a part of a project like this, or somebody's set elevated expectations and under-delivered. And so as much as I think we should strive to come up in altitude and find the common ground, I think there's also an opportunity to come down in altitude to meet somebody in their functional group where they're at, to listen carefully to what sort of experiences they've had in the past. Because to your point, that there are a lot of instances where all that somebody knows is stay in my lane and advocate for price. And so if we want to make something really transformative happen, if we want to move the needle on something complex and nuanced like job fit or retention, some of the problems we're trying to solve, I think all of those stakeholders are needed. And so there's a real one-on-one effort even in a lot of these projects for me to spend time with each functional leader to really listen to why do they think what they think, what have they experienced that leads them to where they are today, and I think it's worth it. Like I had a new client this week even that they came in 10 out of 10 skeptical. They were not the champion of the project. They were not even the first layer of stakeholders that were included. And when they were invited, they were quite skeptical. And we spent an hour together one-on-one, and it helped dramatically. And she helped surface another important stakeholder that has expressed skepticism in other ways. And I know you've been there, so this is probably humorous to you, but I think in general, to answer your question, make meaningful progress in meaningful areas, we need to do it together. We have to find common ground. And at times that means coming down in altitude to really deal with some of the scar tissue from past experiences that haven't gone well, because we can't move on without all the key stakeholders.
Yeah. As I'm listening to this is fun because I'm now comparing what you do from Two Story with your educational background of the science, the hard sciences and the soft sciences and business, and learning the nuances and the commonality that people can discover in those if they take the time to talk to all those stakeholders.
Yeah.
And really understand the essence of what it's about. So I find this fascinating. And so I'm going to jump now. I want to I'd like you to share in a little detail the when Two Story gets up in the morning and thinks about an ideal place to transfer value, because you guys are all about how do we transfer value to organizations where they're substantially better when we're done than they were when we started. How do you identify, in my language, the ideal buyer, and what do they look like, and where do you want to take them? And then I want you to eventually get to how you think about root cause data, because just as we've been talking, it's for each of the silos have to get it and understand it and be part of it, and so on and so forth. So give us a little overview of that.
I'll give the next chapter of the story on why Two Story was created, what we did in our early years, I think, to set the stage for your question. Two Story was born out of Aperio. So our consulting engagements became increasingly tech oriented, where we brought on a third partner that has his PhD in computer science and electrical engineering, and began to experiment with and test the use of AI and machine learning with our clients, and solved, again, I mentioned some of the clients we worked with and continue to work with, but we solved some really complex problems. But when you ask the question of the ideal buyer, we learned a lot about where are those capabilities best deployed, what problems are they most appropriate to solve, where the value is self-evident, easily quantifiable and self-evident to the key stakeholders on the client side. And so to summarize, Two Story is an AI startup. We blend machine learning with people analytics so that organizations can tune into their workforce at scale. We partner with clients to unify people data with business outcomes to diagnose the root cause of what's working for growth and success for individuals and for organizations. And so when we think about root cause, it's about bringing people data and business outcomes together so that we can identify really, like, what are the business implications for hiring, and what are the operational signals that indicate things like retention. For a variety of reasons, as you know, Rick, these data sets have been siloed for a long time. The technology systems, the processes, the departments that house people data is often with HR. Operational and financial data is often with operations, accounting, and finance. And so when we think about bringing this data together, it's about finding signal within the people data. It's about using operational and financial data sets to give us focus to find out which people data sets matter and how to utilize the data. So to take an example, when we think about job fit, you and I have collaborated for a number of years now on the use of psychometrics. We continue to use psychometrics as a way to understand what makes individuals tick. How do they behave? How do they communicate? How do they deal with conflict? How do they relate to others? What are their values? How do they make decisions? What do they prioritize, and what do they devalue? What is their acumen, and what are their habits? This is a rich data set to understand individuals, how they operate, and how they're likely to show up in the workplace. That data set's been used for a long time by HR to inform things like behavioral-based interview questions and inform the hiring process. We take that a step further and actually bring in data analytics to look at a whole cohort of individuals and their performance so that we can begin to draw some conclusions on what is the profile of the ideal candidate? What are the characteristics that define and even predict performance or retention in this role? And so for us, the ideal client, they have some data structure in place. They're collecting performance data in some way. And they also psychologically, they understand that people drive business outcomes. They often don't know how to operationalize that. They don't often have the technology in place to put that philosophy in play. But we have an initial, we agree on that point that at the end of the day, almost every business is a people business. And if you understand that, and if you have data that's available, even if it's quite siloed, we can help you bring it together so that you can begin to make smarter decisions around hiring, development, and retention.
Wow, interesting. Just as you were talking, so many light bulbs kind of go off repeatedly. And one of the things that from a live a revenue culture piece, just as you started to describe the work you do, often today, people, particularly in marketing, but sales and marketing, they start with a profile of the human that they want to talk to. And I loved where you started. Maybe it wasn't, and maybe I misinterpreted that, but you started, as I heard it, with people who have a particular problem that they want solved. And
Yeah.
then you're going to understand the people. But I think too often we just create this profile and we go after the profile without even asking, does the profile recognize they have this problem, or is it in their top 20 to fix?
Yeah.
And you're really starting in another place. Did I get that right?
You're spot on. I recognize that there are trade-offs with this approach because when we start with people who have this particular problem, we have now been in multiple industries solving this problem. We've been in SMB insurance companies, and we've been in the Department of Energy National Laboratory at Los Alamos. And so when we prioritize and focus on the profile of the ideal buyer, where they're problem aware and they are open-minded to using people data to solve business outcomes, we have an immediate connection with the buyer. And yet where we're often then putting in a little bit of extra work is to tailor the tools and technology to that industry. And so I bring that up because I think it's a little bit of a contrarian take that I agree there are enormous advantages in leading with the problem aware and the psychology of the buyer, because our relationships with our clients are really, I consider them friends. I mean, we work closely with these people to solve a problem that will change their career. But our technology team is incredibly adaptable to make the technology feel tailor-made for Department of Energy or an insurance company. And so I think as we think about a strategy as a whole, we are prioritizing working with buyers that, again, really understand and care about the problem and are open to using people data to solve business outcomes. And we've learned that means our technical team needs to be pretty agile. Our data scientist is one of the most adaptable. I mean, you would love Bryce. Rick, he grew up on a farm in Mississippi. He's incredibly brilliant, but one of the most down-to-earth technologists that I've ever met. And I think him and Carrie, they are like the secret sauce for what we do, because their ability to make something that's relevant for 10 people feel tailor-made for one. I think it's a really important part of what we do.
Wow. That, thank goodness you're telling these stories today, because I'm seeing the picture clearer and clearer and clearer as we dive into this. So, there's a couple of ways we can go here. One is we can talk about the details of how two-story works with clients. The other is to talk about the bigger picture of how do you think about problems differently,
Hmm.
and then you can apply two-story, because it sounds like the first thing you look for are people who think about their problems in a way that your science can help them solve it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, let's start there because I think it sets the stage for how we enter in to partner with them. Um, I had a conversation yesterday with a large agency at a state government, and they have made such a tremendous progress on developing and investing in their employee experience. So for the past 4 years, they've invested a ton of time, energy, and resources in developing training, creating feedback loops, being able to really analyze that data from the employee experience and be able to respond to it. They've adopted a number of programs that spun out from employee suggestions and recommendations, and they've built what I would describe as a really solid foundation. And yet they find themselves with all of these programs now established, they find themselves frankly at max capacity for their ability to implement the programs. And so the conversation we had yesterday was about program effectiveness. We had a conversation about, hey, we hear you and we see with evidence your investment in improving the employee experience in pursuit of higher retention rates. You have exerted a tremendous amount of effort. But Rick, when I began to ask questions on program effectiveness, questions like, do you know which of your programs are making an impact for this job family or for this location or for this particular outcome? Their answers were more anecdotal and qualitative. And so we enter to those particular conversations with the data analytics and the technology to be able to bring all that data together, sometimes for the first time, and be able to work with them to identify what outcome they really care about. And I really should say outcomes, because oftentimes we find the best performance metrics are multiple KPIs that are held in tension. So take the state agency. They care about retention, but they can't have retention at the expense of safety. And they can't have retention and safety at the expense of productivity. And so what we really had the conversation of was, let's look at those three outcomes, and let's look at all the program data you're collecting and be able to find clarity and find focus and find awareness of what's mattered to whom, so that we can proceed with confidence and be able to double down on the things that are working, and importantly, to prune the things that aren't. And I know you care a lot about reducing organizational chaos, so I hope this part resonates with you, but the data to know what's signal and what's noise it's unprecedented visibility for some organizations, and it helps them make more confident decisions, particularly when they need to say no, one of the hardest decisions to make.
Wow. We're way off our outline, but this is really cool. Two things I heard, and I'd love your feedback on. One was you used the term capacity,
Mm-hmm.
and you and I've had this conversation before, but going forward, for the sake of employees and organizations, capacity, I think, is going to be one of the key words for the next maybe generation. It's going to be for a long time, because around the world, we know there aren't enough working age people to fill all of the needs that we have out there. So it's not, we'll just go hire two more people. You want to hire two, you might find one that may not even be the ideal person, that you'll be lucky to get one.
Yeah,
And so the challenge for us, I believe, becomes, with the people and resources we have, how do we increase our organizational capacity to transfer more value that we get paid for?
that's right.
And that's also including the capacity for the individual to be fulfilled and to have the opportunity to be creative or innovative, or whatever it is that really makes them want to have a career with your company. So I think capacity is a really big deal, but I think it's a new definition that 10 years ago maybe didn't even really exist. And part of what I heard in your last story was the capacity is unique to each organization and each set of employees in that organization. Did I get both of those kind of right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I would even maybe come down in altitude and suggest that the capacity of each individual will vary based on the role they're in. And finding a role that somebody is well suited for will increase their capacity to make an impact for the organization. And so being able to inform questions like job fit, where is somebody's capabilities best leverage in pursuit of organizational outcomes, is a critical question to help people succeed, and then helping them increase their capacity. Another quick story, and I hope this one is really concrete so it can maybe bring to life what this looks like in the field. But I've mentioned before this project that we're doing on an ongoing basis with Los Alamos. We work with one of their accelerators. It's a deep tech accelerator, and there's a variety of PhDs and postdocs that are seeking to build and commercialize technology. And we know that the transition and the data and our research would suggest that the transition from academic scientist to entrepreneurial leader is massive. Like the gap between those two is significant. And it's quite difficult for many academic scientists to even recognize how much of a transition that is, and to be able to prioritize that when there's so many things vying for their attention, particularly around product, market, timing, competitors, et cetera. Yeah. So we've worked with quite a few academic scientists as they seek to become entrepreneurs. And one of them in particular, this was quite meaningful to me. But about a year ago, I began working with a postdoc who is developing some of the coolest, I can't talk about it in full, but it was like mind-blowing, feels like a sci-fi movie type technology. And he has an enormous potential to do globally impactful work over the course of his career. But his psychometric data, his profile, his habits revealed that a previous mistake leads to a limiting belief that results in a really significant fear of failure. To the point where, and to make this point clear, he shared with me in our conversation last January that before running an experiment, he needed to be in a completely dark room. And so he was going to solder a wire that went over a door so that if the door opened, the wire would break and the experiment would stop. But before he soldered the wire, because he had never done that before, he read a 300-page book to ensure that he did it properly. And again, his program director and PI were sitting next to me when he shared this story. And he didn't realize that was an inappropriate use of his time, that he could ask somebody that had done that before, or frankly, the fear of failure wasn't worth him spending a week and a half reading this book. And we had this real moment where I was just facilitating. I really didn't cause this, but just facilitating a moment where the PI could look at him and say, your time is more valuable than that. And if you were to blow up this whole lab we're in, that would be okay, because the opportunity of what you're pursuing is worth so much more. And so Rick, this created in him, and I checked in with him recently, and his PI, and his autonomy, his creativity, and his innovation from this moment has increased greatly, because he feels freed up to be able to step into some spaces that previously he was self-limited. And so the data to understand what's needed in his role, to compare his data against that benchmark, to reveal that he had a fear of failure, to be able to create a moment where his PI and him could talk about the realities around what he's solving and the opportunity seeking. There is an acceptable risk that needs to be brought into play. It increases his capacity. He is doing work that would have been previously impossible for him. And so I think capacity can be increased at the organizational level. It can be increased at the individual level. And arguably the organizational capacity is the composite of the individual capacity. So finding individuals that are doing meaningful work in meaningful places makes an organization more effective.
Well, and Michael, that sounds like an absolutely spectacular example of identifying a root cause.
Yes. And yeah, thank you for that. Because you reminded me that, we're looking at 120 data points for an individual. We look at their psychometric profile and comparing it against a pretty robust machine learning model predicting entrepreneurial success and the habits that matter for entrepreneur success. And so to process all of that information and arrive at there's something in his past where he failed and now lives with a fear of repeating that moment. That is the unlock. When we talk about facilitation, that's explicitly what we do to facilitate change. We bring that insight to the table so that this postdoc and his PI could say, what is the acceptable risk of failure? What is the threshold that we can tolerate as a lab? And then, where should there be boundaries? Of course, there are always boundaries, but you're right. Being able to isolate the one thing that matters sets the stage for a meaningful conversation.
Well, I mean, my brain is exploding on this for a number of reasons, but as I'm listening, when people ask me my most important book ever, my answer is always The Goal. And I don't know if you've read The Goal, but The Goal talks about, you find this one choke point and then you fix it. And what that does is it shows you there's another choke point that once you fix the first one. And as you're telling this story, I'm imagining we all have that in our lives. And when you help me identify the first one, then I want you to help me identify the next one because I know there is one.
Right.
But the other thing that just came out of that story for me, and you and I are going to have an extension of this conversation, because a dear friend of mine who was a client 35 years ago at Digital Equipment Corporation, which then was a $14 billion computer company, she spent the rest of her career working on entrepreneurship. And, she's written multiple books and she's now semi-retired, but she struggled with this exact thing you just talked about, is how do I take people and in big corporations that have all this stuff surrounding them and help them identify the root cause of why can't I move this forward? Why can't I make this transition to more entrepreneur or more successful entrepreneuring or building the team that surrounds me to do this? So you and I are going to have a call with Susan because I know she's going to want to hear some of this, and she may have some people she'll point you to that, you could help solve that problem because she spent decades, working with major organizations in that area.
I'm incredibly intrigued to move some of our research from the individual and the team level to the organization and cultural level. When we talk about innovation, we talk about entrepreneurship, we've done a lot of work identifying and isolating the habits that distinguish successful individuals, the team dynamics needed to both create and commercialize innovation. I think you and I probably both appreciate there's a real, particularly in a corporate environment, there's some real organization factors and cultural factors that influence entrepreneurship. Even when we think about what's next for some of these projects and some of this work, I think we're going to learn a lot over the next few years on how do we even take a step further beyond the team and move the needle to help organizations become more intrapreneurial or entrepreneurial.
Amen.
Yeah, very interesting.
Well, we're running out of time. You and I could probably do this for another hour or two without too much trouble. But what's one thing you would like to leave us with that you've discovered in all of your creative, collaborative, innovative ways that we should be thinking about to make ourselves and our organizations better?
Such a great question. I think if I had to pick one, Rick, I would encourage people to be really courageous and bold to solve a meaningful problem rather than settle for the problems that are already being worked on. So for instance, when we talked earlier about these macro problems. Why are people leaving and what can I do about it? That's objectively a more complex and harder question than any individual silo can answer, and any one individual can take responsibility for or solve by themselves. And so if I could leave people with one admonishing or one encouragement, it would be to lean into some of the really complex problems. And instead of trying to improve the metrics that are easy to measure, or build more dashboards that tell you things you already know, I would encourage people to press on, to try to find the problems that really matter. Because what we have discovered is that even a 3, 5, 10% change in something that really matters is more impactful than 100% completion of something that's irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. And I'll end with this quote. It's one of my favorite quotes, but the author William Gibson writes that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And I mean, you and I talk about the future a lot. I just want to maybe combine these two ideas in my closing thoughts, that not only would I encourage people to press on, but there are probably people that are doing that you can learn from, that you may not be aware of yet. And so, when we think about the future and combining people data with business outcomes, it's not table stakes in the market. It's not happening everywhere, but it's real. Like, it is happening. And we have the privilege of helping some organizations move in that direction and realize that future. But if you find yourself listening to this and you feel like you are just overwhelmed with activities, like you're resource constrained and you just can't execute on all your good ideas, like you feel like you need to do more with less, my encouragement for you would be to press into problems that really matter. It's crucial that you start with clarity and focus and tackle something that's meaningful rather than settling for something less consequential.
Wow, that's great. Michael, I really thank you for being here, and I thank you for the stories, because we got so much deeper and more, impactful by, sharing those kinds of stories and applying them for the listeners. So thank you, Michael. And for those of you who are watching us today, I thank you for joining us. And you can reach out. Michael's information's on the screen, so reach out to him, and I guarantee you'll have a fantastic experience working with him, and I'm sure he'll help you with capacity and doing something really important. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.